So firstly, the police, just one of the things we've done is we, in our hotspot areas, at our hotspot times, now have a system where a worker from the domestic violence support services goes out with the police, literally. So there is a 999 call about domestic abuse. Straight away, the emergency vehicles will go to tackle whatever is happening. Immediately that's settled. Following behind are what we call the DVSA car, which is a refuge worker and a police officer specially trained. And in they go. The refuge worker has immediate access to the victim and can just talk. And they really have as a motto, whatever it takes.
Is it just me, or is that a really scary motto? Whatever it takes. Sounds a bit like the ends justify the means, isn't it?
So sometimes the person doesn't realise they've been suffering from domestic abuse at all.
Sometimes they don't even realise that they're a victim of domestic assault at all. I don't know how there was a 999 call then. How did that happen? How did they phone about domestic abuse and they don't realise they're a victim of domestic abuse? I suppose it could have been, reported by somebody else, couldn't it? Yeah. It's kind of worrying though, isn't it? Whatever it takes, and they may not realise that they're a victim. So whatever it takes includes doing your darndest to convince them that they are a victim, even if they don't think they are. It's a little worrying, isn't it?
Sometimes they're ready to move and they want to go to a refuge that day. Sometimes the offer is, do you want to meet us in the supermarket in a week's time when he won't know anything about it and we can talk it through, anything you would like. The important point is that the person is no longer on their own, and we in a way use the fact that there's been a police call to get that pastoral support in, as well of course as keeping the police engaged to do whatever's necessary from a policing point of view.
Well, I'm glad she added that. So yes, she'll let the police do whatever they need to do as well. But the really important thing is to get the pastoral care in there. Sounds a bit like recruitment, doesn't it? Sounds a bit like we're going to use this opportunity to do some recruiting.
We had a system right from the start of me being Police and Crime Commissioner, which said that every officer going to a domestic abuse case should leave the business card of the refuge behind, but only 1% of victims got in touch. Since we've introduced this new system, 55% of everybody that this system's contacted have come back to the refuge support workers for help at some stage. And these were all except one people who had not been in touch before. So we are supporting a completely new cohort of very needy people through this fairly simple and quite inexpensive trick.
Trick. I know she's saying trick in a sort of tongue-in-the-cheek way, but it does sound like she's talking about sales. Feels like she's talking about sales, doesn't it? You give them a card and only 1% come forward. But if you're there and you get to get your foot in the door, start doing your spiel, and you get 55% in.
It does mean that the workers have got to be out overnight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, but they willingly take that on. The conversation between the officer and the worker in the car, because I've been with them, is very instructive for both sides.
It sounds like a great opportunity for proselytising.
We've got a kind of backup provision too, which is that we have a couple of domestic violence workers based at police stations who do not go out and do personal work with victims. What they do is, if any officer who's been called out and hasn't had a domestic violence worker with them, because there still are plenty who go on their own, and they're worried about how to safety plan or what the next step should be with an individual, they can simply ring in to the domestic violence worker and get the benefit of that person's long experience in this field to make sure that we put every step right and we don't get any wrong.
So the police, who also have long experience, are encouraged to not have faith in their own judgments and to have to seek pastoral advice Pastoral's a very religious term, isn't it? I know it's used in a non-religious setting, but there's still something a little bit tending to the flock, isn't there, in the actual meaning of the word? It just has certain connotations that I find a little bit disconcerting.
So those couple of examples of how we've tried to improve the police performance and coming on the back of police presence, really, to give support to victims of domestic abuse.
Right, let's take this a bit more seriously. Okay, so the way you're going to look at this automatically, we're supposed to think about this, is that she's offering support to people who are victims. Okay, so it sounds like really, really positive. Except, if you look through this through the lens of this being like a religious cult, you're saying, well, we find people that are really vulnerable. Well, people who are really vulnerable are easily converted. This is just what, you're born again Christians. I used to find I was most likely to be approached by a born again Christian was when I was looking down. I was looking like I was feeling a bit miserable. Being a student, looking a bit miserable. And you get a born again Christian come and trying to befriend you and give you books about Jesus and stuff. So they thought, well, this is a person that looks like they're ready to be saved.
The other side of our policy is really to try and engage more of the public. And we thought how we could do this and decided we would home in on the workplace. So people who are suffering persecution at home quite often have friends at work, and it can be for them a safe haven away from what's going on. And so, will they speak about it though? It's extraordinarily difficult to talk about what is happening in your own private life.
She's right. People often do have people at work they can talk to, their work colleagues, friends. I mean, yeah, people do talk to their friends and work colleagues. Making confessions about your private life is a bonding thing to do, isn't it? Bonding with somebody. And that's kind of what makes it kind of creepy when it's, I don't mind using the word creepy, and I kind of think, oh, it might cast aspersions on Vera. Vera may actually have all the best intentions. She may not really have a cult at all, but I kind of think, well, I feel aspersions are made about me as a man all the time. That, every sort of behaviour you perform, it could be interpreted as creepy. And yeah, there's something creepy about this. There's something creepy about telling people they're victims. And trying to get that message out there, make sure that they know. And partly, you've seen the previous video where we talked about criminality and how she kind of goes, it's not your fault. She'll find a way of making it not your fault if you're a female criminal. Either it's not your fault because you were coerced into doing it, or it's not your fault because you were mentally ill, or it's not your fault because you're a victim of abuse. It kind of means you've been forgiven. And when you feel that you've been forgiven, you then feel indebted to the one who's forgiven you. We're getting into a cult as well.
But if we have an employer who has a policy, just like a health and safety policy, but it's a domestic and sexual abuse policy, and it includes acknowledging forced marriage and the culture-related examples of abuse that we're now well aware of. It is a policy which the workplace adopts, and it simply indicates that if anyone is suffering in that way, the workplace will help and support. And we've got some stories, small ones like a guy, she'd left him, he wouldn't leave her alone. She could block him off her home email, but he emailed her at work instead. Now the employer has this policy. She's been able to say that they've just blocked him off the email at work as well. if he comes, and he has done, the receptionist's got a photograph and knows who he is. So she has a different way of dealing with that. Small things like that can be very important.
See, there's something quite sinister about this as well, because you're blocking the alternative viewpoint. Okay, so you're isolating the person that you've allocated as a victim. Said you're a victim, and then the only person that can present an alternative viewpoint you have isolated her from, so she can't hear the alternative viewpoint. Break off connections with people, and that way we can control your reality. Just saying, there's a sinister interpretation of what she's saying there. I mean, how exactly can receiving an email do you any genuine harm? And to block it is reinforcing the idea that it can do you harm, which makes it more fearful. It can protect you from emails. There's something ghoulish about it, isn't there? So that's like something making somebody afraid of something that really holds no terrors. What terrors can an email hold? I've had periods of my life where I've had people trying to get in contact and they want money from me. And every time the phone's rang, I've gone, oh my God, I'm not going to answer that. I think somebody's going to go, oh, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to cut the phone off. And I don't think that would be helping. At some point, I would have to go, oh, well, I'm going to answer the phone. I sort of know what it's like to actually be afraid of correspondence, to have it supported. That doesn't seem helpful. That seems the opposite of helpful. It's not helping somebody overcome their fear, it's legitimizing it. Okay, so there's a little thing that's going on with Vera Baird. She has a charity called Victims First Northumberland, and she's been in a bit of a scandal because she was supporting this charity. As commissioner, she could decide which charities money went to in the area, and as she happened to own a charity, she decided that was the charity the money was going to go to. Okay, so PCC, that's Police Crime Commissioners, Vera Baird's role in crime victim charity questioned. Claims a police and crime commissioner had a conflict of interest in awarding money to a charity of which she is a director are being probed by the Ministry of Justice. Northumbria PCC Vera Baird's role at Victims First Northumbria emerged as it started providing victim support services in the region. Her office is understood to have agreed to give the organisation £500,000. Mrs. Baird said all Ministry of Justice protocols were adhered to in awarding the cash. The Ministry of Justice has made a request for information from her. However, it said there was no intention to investigate the setting up of Victims First Northumbria or Mrs. Baird's decision to fund it. In a statement, it said PCCs had to show victims' needs were being met. The decisions on local funding arrangements were for individual PCCs to determine. Needs have been met. Victims' needs have been met. So presumably, the more people she has going to the victim support, the more likely she is to be able to fund it, right? And she's also talking about what sounds like very much a sales pitch. It's like having refuge workers as sort of ambulance chasers going to every crime scene, making sure they get in there first. You heard what she said. Whatever it takes. Sometimes they don't realise they've been abused at all, but we convince them. And that's so much better than leaving a card, because if you leave a card, only 1% get in contact with you. But if you're there with your spiel, 55% get in contact with you. Good sales. It justifies the charity that she is a director of. and she's awarding money to. So she's got two roles: as a director of a charity, in which she's receiving money, and as a police crime commissioner, in which role she's deciding where the money goes. And she decides the money goes to the charity she's director of. Okay, back to the article. Excellent value. The Ministry of Justice requires PCCs not to be subject to conflicts of interest when providing victim services, and has the power to investigate any possible conflict of interest and to cease funding if such a conflict is established, etc. National charity Victim Support has offered help to victims of crime across the country. The power to allocate cash was recently devolved to PCCs, and the service in the Northumbria Force area is now run by VFN, Victims First Northumbria. In a statement, Mrs. Baird said, "I looked at a number of options, as did all police and crime commissioners, to ensure we would offer excellent value for money and a service that always puts victims first and addresses their every need. All Ministry of Justice procedures and protocols were adhered to." Chief Constable Sue Sim, who is also a director of VFN, is currently being investigated over her treatment of staff, and announced last week she was to retire from the force in June. Bear in mind this is April 2015, so it's over a year old. She has since retired, Sue Sim. Yeah, Sue Sim has retired, but she was in the news a couple of months ago complaining that Northumbria Police were a boys' club, and that the only reason that she was accused of bullying, which is why she left, was because they couldn't handle a strong woman, which they have denied. So she's kind of still vaguely scandalous. Northumbria Police has confirmed she will stand down as director and trustee of the VFN at the same time. That's Sue Sim. There's something rotten in the state of Northumbria. So that article was the 16th of April, wasn't it? 16th of April 2015. There's a slightly earlier one. This is from Chronicle Live, which is the local newspaper. Victim support offices on Tyneside could close as a new Victims First service for the region opens. So this is the 1st of April, so it's a fortnight before, in fact. Fortnight before that article on the BBC website. Victims of crime on Tyneside return to a new service for support from Wednesday. Northumbria Police and Crime Commissioner PCC Vera Baird is launching a new independent victim referral hub called Victims First Northumbria to replace some of the services previously provided by the charity Victim Support. Mrs. Baird said the new service will be more victim-focused than Victim Support were. I don't know what focus Victim Support had that wasn't victim-focused. That's strange, isn't it? But some Victim Support volunteers fear that years of expertise is being lost. And they claim the victims, who they are currently working with, could be left high and dry while services are changing over. Mrs. Baird took the decision to set up the new service after the government, which had provided 80% of the charity's funding, devolved decisions on victim care spending to a local level, with individual police and crime commissioners determining how help is provided in their own force area. The Commissioner says the new approach will deliver a better service to every individual whose life is blighted by crime. Northumbria PCC is so far one of just 2 PCCs in the country to choose to replace existing victim support services. Maybe there isn't that many PCCs that are directors of a charity. The charity's main Newcastle office will remain open. The future of its other branches in North Tyneside, Sunderland, the Gate said, is not clear. Retired police officer Norman Dunbar has raised concerns alongside some victim support staff. The tragedy in this is the great loss of experience, dedication, or disappear of the volunteers, he said. These volunteers dealt with some of the most vulnerable members of the community, not the easiest people to deal with, and all the years of experience and trust that we lost are irreplaceable. I am a retired officer, obviously of a great deal of experience of victims and their problems, and knew the value of the victim support service, and believe it is a travesty that such a valued service should be lost by being transformed into an afterthought overseen by the PCC or the police. But Mrs. Baird said the Victims First service, which she hopes will eventually become a charity. So far in its infancy, it wasn't even a charity at the time she transferred funding to it. Will see each victim of crime assign their own coordinator who can make sure they receive all the help they need. Every police officer who attends a crime will carry out a risk and harm assessment for the victim and a care plan. He or she will then pass on to Victims First, to a victim care coordinator who will call up the victim and discuss the way forward and try to give them all they need to cope and recover, she explained. I have a directory of services and lots of places we can refer people to. Our intention is to see them right through the recovery process. Mrs. Baird is hoping to recruit staff from a wide range of backgrounds and communities, and the Victims First service will not discriminate between types of incident, with victims of antisocial behaviour being offered as much support as those of more serious crimes. Something about this that seems to me a bit odd, but very, very in keeping with the sort of feminist rhetoric of today. Victims First service will not discriminate between types of incident, with victims of antisocial behaviour being offered as much support as those of more serious crimes. Doesn't this remind you of the sort of Motte and Bailey, where you have a continuum of unpleasant experiences, and then you treat all those unpleasant experiences as though they are the high end of that continuum, right? Regardless of how minor the experience you've had, you need all that attention to make it clear to you that you are a victim. I think this will help the cops to become even more victim focused, added Mrs. Baird. The biggest practical change, though, is that everyone will get support and it will be personal to them. Anyone who becomes a victim of crime from today will be referred by the police to the Victim First service. The Victim Support has vowed to continue providing services through its specialised projects, including those surrounding hate crime and antisocial behaviour. And families bereaved by murder or manslaughter will continue to be supported by the Victim Support's homicide team. A spokesman for Victim Support said, as a charity who supported tens of thousands of victims across Northumbria over the last 30 years, we know how important it is that people affected by crime get the best possible help. We're immensely proud of the contribution our staff and volunteers have made to helping more vulnerable people cope and recover from the effects of crime. Victim Support has developed and delivered a range of specialist services across the region, including projects to tackle domestic violence and antisocial behaviour. We continue to seek with the PCC ways for our staff and volunteers to continue their vital work so the communities across Northumbria continue to benefit from their skills and experience. Victim Support is committed to ensuring the employment rights of its staff are respected during this period of change. So, there's an existing charity in there, and because she has the right to choose what sort of services are available and what sort of services get funded, she cuts the funding to the existing charity in order to fund her own. I know the obvious thing is to think it's all about money, you know what I mean? It is. I think it's about ideological purity, you know. I think that she's decided she can do better. I just get the impression that she's a control freak. And I think it's a culty thing, you know. I don't think it's a money thing. I think it's a cult thing. And there's a reason why I think that. It's because I think she's a bit deluded. So if you haven't seen the video Vera's Fallen Women, have a look at that. That's really about her perception of female criminals. She sees all female criminals as victims in some way or other. Usually victims of male coercion or victims of male abuse, or suffers from mental illness, which of course actually is a catch-all term really for any criminal. I'm talking about men being hyper agents and women being hypo agents. Yes, she very firmly seems to believe that sort of model of things. Because it's one of the mysteries of philosophy. You know, this the philosophy, how philosophy applies to law, maybe. Yeah, we could all claim to be victims in a way. Whether, I suppose this really inspired me to think about this because I was listening to Hugo and Jake on the Bible Reloaded. The Bible Reloaded, or it might be the Quran Reloaded yesterday. And I think it was the Quran Reloaded. And it came up with the discussion of if everything's preordained by God, do we really have free will? So, you know, obviously that's even a problem. Even if you remove God from the equation, that's still a problem. Still a philosophical problem is if there is determinism, can we have free will? It's a philosophical problem. It becomes a problem with consent as well, doesn't it? When it comes down to, you know, was somebody consenting or not? The radical feminists always seem to have a new form of coercion they've discovered. That goes, oh, this means that that person didn't really consent because there was some form of coercion involved. Same thing, you know, when do I really have free will? We could do the same thing with micto and forced marriages. Micto would start claiming that every marriage is really a forced marriage because there's been some form of coercion, societal coercion in some way. That would be a bit silly. I mean, you could do it philosophically, but you wouldn't want to apply that philosophy to the law and start saying, no, we should ban all marriages because they're all forced marriages, really. You might want to keep that philosophy to yourself and go, are any marriages really not forced marriages in some way or other? You'd have to expand the definition of forced. But you could do that, philosophically, you could do that. Yeah. I mean, as I was saying, you're going to go crazy micto and start implying that, you know, men are constantly being coerced into marriage against their will. This reminds me actually of Camille Paglia. She's talking about sort of primal fears. The female primal fear of the homme fatale is that he leaves. He leaves holding the baby, as it were. And the primal fear towards the femme fatale is that she stays. You can't even. The phrase she uses is embowerment, like Titania and Bottom. Bottom is embowered. Another mythological character that you could say is embowered is Odysseus. Odysseus is supposed to be going home to his wife, but all the time he's being embowered by sorceresses he can't escape the clutches of because he just falls desperately in love with them. Can't leave their islands because they've cast a spell on him. They've cast a spell on him. It's not that. It's not him. It's not his weakness that makes him unable to leave. It's because they have been enchantresses. They've cast a spell on him. And I think about the primal fear of empowerment when I listen to that Sandman video where he's talking about zombie vaginas. Yeah, this is your primal fear of empowerment here. You're afraid of the woman that doesn't leave. And actually, you're afraid the woman doesn't leave because it's not really her not leaving you, it's you not being able to leave her. what you're afraid of. I know people are going to go, oh my God, you're liking the vetoes of the feminists. You're just like the trans. There's a similarity in that both groups are kind of trying to seek some sort of self-sovereignty. And the fact of the matter is that none of us have full self-sovereignty because we're all subject to a certain number of forces outside of our control, including our own impulses, our non-conscious impulses. And as a result, we can never have full self-sovereignty. And that's nothing gendered about that. That is just the nature of humanity. We never have full self-sovereignty. And if your quest for self-sovereignty is too relentless, is too exacting, then you're going to be constantly frustrated and bitterly disappointed in life. And it's the same as true of criminals. You could say all of them are victims in some way or other. What you've got to do is sort of favour predestination or determination over the notion of free will. And it is one of those tricky philosophical issues that never gets completely unravelled. The interesting difference between responsibility and blame, of course, is that you can be responsible for something without being fully to blame, or you can take responsibility without necessarily being fully responsible. You see what I mean? Like if you're the manager of a company, you're responsible for what the company does, even if it wasn't on your orders. Even if, one of your employees has decided to do something that you probably wouldn't approve of as the manager, and you get a customer complaint saying, one of your employees did this to me. Yeah, okay, I've got to take responsibility for that. It's my company. Even though it wasn't my decision, even though one of my employees has taken it into their hands to call a customer a cunt or something. Yeah, it's not a company policy for our employees to call customers cunts, but I will take responsibility for that because I am the manager. So I will offer my apology, and the employee in question will be dealt with. So as a manager, you take responsibility for something that's not your fault. So there's a difference between responsibility and fault anyway. So even if you may not feel that something was completely within your free will, fact is, if you did it, you're still the one to take responsibility for it. We're a stopgap in the whole question of determinism versus free will. They can resolve that dilemma by saying, no, we don't have free will, because men have free will. Why have we got free will and you haven't? No, that dilemma is a dilemma for all of us. That's a philosophical thing that we all think, do I really have free will? Or is it being predetermined? It's cause and effect. If everything has been caused by something, then even my behaviours have been caused by things. It's a cop-out. Pass it on and going, no, I don't. No, the people that have free will are those people over there. We both ate the apple, darling. Both Adam and Eve ate the apple. We both have knowledge of good and evil. I am, of course, an atheist, so when I say that, I am using the term we both ate the apple completely figuratively. I'm not saying that is why we have free will, because we ate the apple. I am, even if it was, it's in itself, it's kind of perplexing. If we do have free will because we ate the apple, then it means eating the apple is predetermined anyway. So it's not really a solution. I was just making a mythological illusion, that's all. Okay, I was slightly rambling off topic there, but back to Vera. Vera doesn't seem to think that women have free will, because men have free will. Victims First Northumbria isn't the only charity she's a trustee of. She's also a trustee of a charity called Respect. Respect does actually deal or claim to deal with the male victims of domestic abuse. But that's a sideline. Mainly, it deals with the perpetrators of domestic abuse and trying to get them to see the error of their ways and train them in ways of dealing with being abusers. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but I said it in another video, but I thought this was one of those things where I thought, a plague on both your houses. When the Tories wanted to cut funding, Tories being Tories, is wanted to cut funding everything. When they wanted to cut funding to women's shelters, what they did to this women's shelters, to be continue being funded, you have to deal with male victims of domestic abuse as well as female victims of domestic abuse. Of course, they knew full well that the women's shelters would say no to that, and then they have an excuse to cut the funding. I said, this is one of those instances where I'm thinking a plague on both your houses, because it was a bit tricksy there, because the Tories knew full well that the women's refuges weren't going to accept that sort of thing, and knew this would be an excuse to cut funding. But then some, thinking outside the box, might say, oh yeah, we'll do that as well. And this kind of concerns me because, as I said, if you were a victim of domestic abuse, would you really want to go to feminists for help? And Respect, although Vera is a trustee of Respect, she's not the coordinator. Coordinator is somebody called Joe Todd. If you look at Joe Todd's Twitter account, you see some familiar suspects on Joe Todd's Twitter feed, including Jess Phillips, Holly Neat, Angham Debonair, she's MP for Bristol, accused a Bristol student of sending death threats. In fact, the student in question, I don't even know if the student was male or female, the student in question that had just tweeted "Get in the sea," which is a colloquial phrase in Bristol. She said, "Oh, you want me to drown?" You don't have to get in the sea. Just somebody tweets you, "Get in the sea." No, I actually have to get in the sea. It's not a death threat. It's a metaphor, isn't it? And of course, Vera Baird. Joe Todd has such tweets as challenging men's violence and abuse, entitlement and privilege on IWD 2016. Just another day at the office. Challenging men's violence and abuse, entitlement and privilege. Is this somebody you'd want to go to if you were actually a victim of domestic abuse? I think it's slightly off topic here because I think perhaps Respect requires a video of its own. And secondly, I suppose there must be people in the MRM who may have used their services, so I would like to know, if anyone can tell me, if anyone's had any experiences with Respect, because there are things about their website that kind of disturbed me. But if I put it briefly, basically, as a sideline, they have male victims of domestic abuse, but on the whole, their charity is about training perpetrators to not be perpetrators anymore by giving them techniques such as timeout. I've got an article on timeout I want to read to you, and again, I think it's going to be too long for this. So it's generally sort of wrap it up in a sort of thing. I think, from what I can gather, is they'll try their darndest to convince you that you're the perpetrator. If you went to them and said, "Oh, I'm a victim of domestic abuse," if you're male, I think they'll try and convince you you're the perpetrator. And then they'll use that as a sort of foot in the door to start teaching about privilege and how you're over entitled. Try and train you into being docile, taking on greater burdens. I don't think they're actually going to help anyone. Even people that actually are genuine perpetrators, I don't think they'll get under the underlying causes for why you are, because I think that they will assume that the reason that somebody is a perpetrator is because they have too much power, and so they'll be kind of saying, "Without less power." It won't be about actually dealing with whatever personality defects it is that actually causes people to have to express themselves violently. There's a certain indebtedness that comes with both being a hyper agent and a hypo agent. Hypo agent is indebted because they feel helpless. A victim feels helpless. An abuser, somebody's been labelled as abuser, has to be all in self-control, and they also have to be repentant. There's two forms of dependency there. There's dependence by being repentant, so repentant dependency, and there is also this sort of childlike dependency of saying, "Don't worry, we'll look after you, we'll keep you safe." So there's two kinds of dependency. It's kind of trying to nurture there, trying to nurture two different forms of dependency. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to respect because I think it's interesting and I think it requires a video on itself. So I think it is trying to extend the idea of male hyper agency and female hypo agency, as does the previous video. If you look into that, Vera's Fallen Women. The other thing I want to say is always talk of victim focused, being focused on victims rather than the victim, because you're the victim of a crime. Victim isn't an identity. It isn't what you are all your life, right? It's not an identity to be a victim. It's you are the victim of an incident, victim of a crime, right? There's a sort of suggestion that she sort of enrolls people as victim, so that is their identity rather than their role in a specific incident. And the police are going to be victim focused as opposed to criminal focused, presumably. We're not going to spend all our time trying to catch criminals. We're going to spend all our time catching victims. I say catching, I mean recruiting them. The fact that she keeps saying victims first, and even female criminals are victims.
And so we sat back and we thought about the two pieces of work we'd done, and we concluded that when we considered victims of crime who largely had suffered from domestic or sexual abuse, and when we considered defendants in crime who largely had been thrown into chaos by their experiences of sexual and domestic abuse, that actually we were talking about the same people.
And she has this recruitment drive. Involve these women's refuge workers always going to scenes of crime and trying to recruit.
Whatever it takes. So sometimes the person doesn't realise they've been suffering from domestic abuse at all.
There's something really weird going on, and it seems sinister and unsavoury. I think that's all I'll say really right now. It's just arousing my suspicions. That's all I've got to say for now. Because as I say, I'm going to look into respect, and I think that's probably a separate video in its own right. So I'll keep this one short in order that I can spend more time on respect, because I think that's another part of the puzzle. If anyone has been in contact with respect, gone through it as a male victim of domestic violence, whether you experience it as a positive or negative, because you might, I'm not only confirmation bias here. If you go along and no, I use respect, they were brilliant, they really helped me out, and that's fine, I'll hear that too. But if you have any sort of stories where you've gone along to respect and they really have tried to convince you that you're the perpetrator, and then told you that everything is your fault, and I want to hear that too. Whatever stories you got about that, I'd like to hear that before I do a follow-up video on that. I must also point out that one of the fronts for the charity called Respect is Men's Advice Line, or the Men's Advice Line. which is at mensadviceline.org.uk. That is run by Respect, so that's the same company. So when I'm asking about if anyone's got any experiences of Respect, Men's Advice Line is the same thing. Actually, it has made me wonder, thinking about it, and also talking with somebody who's spoken with Pauline, and I've spoken to Pauline myself, but speaking to a woman who's been speaking with Pauline, and talking about victimhood. Is it even a good way of talking about a relationship, or calling it abusive, rather than calling it dysfunctional? If you call it dysfunctional, you would acknowledge the agency on both parties, wouldn't you? Right? When you talk about something as dysfunctional, but if you look at a relationship and you go, oh, which one's the abuser, which one's the victim? As if they must fall into those two roles. I mean, I suppose there are relationships in which they do fall into one of those two roles. But you'd think in most sort of domestic strife, in fact, what you would actually find is a relationship that's dysfunctional, an unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship, and necessarily an abusive one. Like the whole phrase oppression. You say, oh, I'm oppressed, there has to be an oppressor. Who does that? And if there does have to be an oppressor for you to be oppressed, as I say, an atmosphere in a room can be oppressive, can't it? You go, oh, it's quite a bit oppressive in here, isn't it? A bit dark, makes me feel miserable, makes me feel uncomfortable. It's an oppressive atmosphere. So I suppose you don't necessarily have to have an oppressor for there to be oppression. But anyway, yeah, that's the thing. Codependencies, talk about codependencies. Codependencies are mutually vampiric, aren't they? So you don't have to, when you look at a relationship, that's not a healthy relationship, you don't have to call it an abusive relationship necessarily. You can say it was a dysfunctional relationship. You're always looking things through the lens of trying to see something as an abusive relationship. As I say, you then cast into two roles. One of them is the role of being helpless. So the victim, and victims are helpless. And one of them into the role of being repentant, because they're the one that's full of evil. Makes them both feel indebted to the cult. If you're the one that is repentant, and it is the cult that can save you. And if you're the one that's helpless, it's the cult that will protect you. Yeah, so before I sign off, I'll recommend a documentary to you watch. It's quite long, but I'm sure I'll link to it. It's about a women's refuge scheme in Sweden. I think the documentary is called Gender War. It was refuge has sort of a cultish element about it. But before you do that, I'm going to read you a little tweet that I found on Joe's wall. Okay. Yeah, so this tweet has been tweeted originally by Speaking Out, saying another interesting find in the archive, a letter from a man complaining that Women's Aid has kidnapped his wife, and Joe Todd has retweeted it. They won't let me go near my wife, the man says. My wife has left me. She has gone with our children to Women's Aid, and they refuse to tell me where they have hidden her. Is it legal for these women to kidnap my wife and kids? I admit I was a bit rough on my wife, but I'm willing to make it up to her. But how can I when they won't let me near her? To which Joan, just Joan, replies, if your wife wanted you to know where she was, I am sure she would get in touch with you. Clearly she doesn't, so don't blame Women's Aid. Blame the person who called to seek the help of these kind and caring women in the first place. You. Yeah, but consider if it was a parent talking about the fact that their child had been whisked away by the Moonies and they don't know from them. And if, as we say, they're making sure that she's not going to even receive any emails from him. Because, no, we'll protect you from the emails. They've got power over her because they have cut off any contact with anyone who disputes the worldview that they're pouring into the person. The worldview that they're pouring into the person tells them that they're a victim and they're helpless. They're feeding that person's fears. His concern could be quite legitimate. It's quite a weird behaviour, isn't it? To not even countenance talking to somebody again. Not even by some sort of correspondence, even a safe correspondence of, a letter or something. We talk about parental alienation all the time, but is there an element where somebody else is taking over the life of another human being and turning him against you? If you look at these sorts of things as partner alienation, and if his concern is legitimate, just Joan has been quite heartless there. Blame yourself! It's all you. Bloody hell. And if the person actually has escaped an abusive relationship and they have a predisposition to allowing their life to be controlled by another person, they've just been delivered into the hands of somebody that wants to control their lives with a belief system. Getting out of the frying pan into the fire. I do suggest you watch Gender War, because otherwise what I'm saying sounds very tin-hatty, and I don't think it is that tin-hattish. And when you take into consideration what you see in Gender War, so have a look at Gender War. So as you know, it's just one blind man reporting on the nature of elephants. Other opinions available. Cheerio.